Just like Professor Carden said, Sweden is usually held up like a utopia, some dream country. Now, I've lived on three continents myself, and in all three, I've met people just come up to me and say, "Wow, you're from Sweden. It's like the perfect country on earth. How is it there?" And I usually tell them, "Oh, it's not perfect." And it's not. And this is usually how Swedes see Sweden. The egalitarian, peaceful, prosperous, green, moral, and socially just society. And that's usually how other people see Sweden as well, for some reason. But the thing is that this is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you ask a Swede, he will tell you that this is truth. Sweden is very egalitarian, and that is true. It is peaceful for the last 200 years. It is prosperous, according to most official numbers. It is green. There's a lot of discussion on environmentalism and animal welfare. It is moral, whatever that means. And socially just. There's a huge welfare state with lots of redistribution of capital from the poor to the rich and from the rich to the poor. And you see the quote here, Sweden is the best and socially most advanced place in the world. You hear people say that today, but this quote is from the 1930s. People said that back then too, and nothing has changed. They say the same thing. So let's take a look at the myth. This is probably what you've heard somewhere, and this might be what you believe. Sweden is one of the most richest countries in the world. And this used to be the case, so it's not that strange that you actually might believe this. And we'll take a look at that later. Sweden has successfully found a middle way between socialism and capitalism. It's the third way, the Swedish model, you might have heard. But this is a model that has been tried in many, many countries. I lived for a year in Taiwan, where the president back then, he wrote a book saying that he had found a new way of organizing society, a third way between socialism and capitalism. That was in 2002. But Sweden has tried that since the 30s. So everybody's trying to find this middle way for some reason. Might be an Aristotelian kind of thing, the golden mean or the golden average between two extremities. Sweden has a very well-functioning welfare state with free, top-quality education and healthcare for all. This is the goal. This is what the welfare state promises. I'll show you whether it's true or not. And Sweden has abolished poverty. Everybody's rich. We'll see if this is true too. You can ask the homeless people in the streets of Stockholm if it is true. And there are thousands of those. Let's see what we're going to do today. I'm going to guide you through an economic political history first of Sweden, the last 1,200 years. I'm going to do it really quickly, so don't worry. We're going to go through the Swedish mentality, how Swedish people think, the Swedish mindset, if you will. Then we'll go through quickly the Swedish welfare state, what it is about, what it promises, and what it delivers. And I'm going to tell you the results of a report from 2002, it's only available in Swedish, unfortunately, but it discussed what if Sweden was the 51st state in the United States. Where would it be? Would it be the richest state or the poorest state or somewhere in between? How would Swedes be compared to other Americans and ethnic groups in America? So these are the 4 points. We'll begin with the history, and in the beginning I'll just go through it really, really quickly so you know what I'm talking about, what Sweden is all about. The explorers, the Vikings. Now that's 1,200 years ago, as you can see. Swedes were going everywhere, and I think they went to Iran long before Americans were there. Then nothing really happened for 600 years. You had a king, you had a unified kingdom, but then you had the empire of Sweden. It was a big power. And in the 30-year war in Europe, it was one of the big, powerful countries on the Protestant side, and that religious war. And part of that you can see the picture down here. It's a famous ship built by the Swedish king that it sailed probably 250 yards before it sank. So it's still available. It's in a museum in Stockholm where it sank. It never got very far. And then let's move on to the 1800s. Now in 1809, it was the last war that Sweden fought. And that's when Sweden, I put it here that Finland is granted sovereignty. It's more like Sweden lost Finland to Russia. That's where Sweden lost probably half the territory. And then Sweden was a very backwards country with a rich and very war-minded king, you could say. Always going to Europe trying to get riches. Every time the king went to Europe, the rest of Europe, continental Europe, with his army, he came back with lots of silver and gold. So if you go to Swedish churches, and there are lots of churches, every village had their own church from 1500s or something like that. You will see that the crucifix is usually made by some Belgian guy or French guy, and it was stolen from those guys. So usually all those very nice things in Swedish churches, they were never made in Sweden. They were stolen from some other country. And then just because Sweden was so backwards, was a farming state just like most states back then, in the latter half of the 19th century, 1 million people emigrated to the U.S. It's 25% of the Swedish population. It tells you something of how nice it was living in Sweden. And that was at the same time, you had lots of starvation. People were dying. You had to have a permit to move from your village to the next village. You needed a permit from the church and the state. The same was true if you wanted to leave to the U.S. You needed a permit. But that permit was easier to get because everybody was starving. So if you left, there was more for the rest. Then, when this immigration started, you had a very powerful classical liberal movement. They wanted to deregulate. They wanted to democratize society. So you had immense deregulation. So going from a king-ruled market, you went pretty fast to a very, very liberal market. A very, very free market, you could say. And that, of course, led to growth, led to lots of companies, people making money, a lot of movement within Sweden, people moving to the cities and so forth. And this classical liberal movement also democratized Sweden. So Sweden is still a monarchy with a king, but the king nowadays is just a face. You could say he's the marketing guy for the state of Sweden. He doesn't really have a purpose. He's spending money, but he's not doing anything. He's living in the castle. In 1905, Norway is lost. That's probably the last real thing that a Swedish king ever did, granting Norway sovereignty. And Norway was not lost to another power in a war. It was more like the Swedish king wanted to be friendly with the Norwegian people. So you've probably seen the Nobel Prize. Nobel was a Swedish industrialist and innovator. And most Nobel Prizes are given to people in Stockholm, in Sweden. But the Peace Prize is given in Norway, in Oslo, by the Norwegian Parliament. And the reason for this is that the guy Nobel died before 1905 when Norway was part of Sweden. So he wanted to give the Norwegians something, so he gave them the least important Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. And then in 1914, that's really the last thing that happened with a king, where there was this crisis. You've never heard of it, and you will never hear of it again. But the king gave a speech in the courtyard, the castle courtyard in Stockholm, and that's when he lost all his powers. Suddenly, we got democracy and parliamentarianism. Now let's go back to this deregulation and see what happened a lot of companies were started around different innovations. And these companies grew very, very big, very, very fast. You see them here from 1873 to, 1937. You had a long time period with lots of growth in certain companies. And the funny thing is that these companies, if you ask any Swede today, these are still the big companies. Nothing has happened for 100 years. It's the exact same companies. You might have heard of some of them, but most of these are producing industrial tools. Ericsson is producing phone line infrastructure for cell phones and stuff. You probably heard of Volvo and Saab, and they're both American nowadays. But the others, Atlas Copco, ASEA, and SKF, they're all producing industry tools. They're not that high tech that you might think of when you think of Sweden. There's a lot of high tech too, but the big companies, the big business in Sweden, they're still industry based. Now this tells us something, that these big companies are still the big ones. Nothing new has happened since then. There's been some companies that have grown and some companies that have filed for bankruptcy, of course. But the really big ones, they're still the big ones. Part of the reason for this is that the government is subsidizing these companies, and these companies are granting government their support. And what is called the self-forgotten spirit, which was very, very at the core of the Swedish state in the 50s and 60s, where you have the government, the LO, which is the big workers' union, and the SAF, which is the organization for big business in Sweden. These three, they meet every year in a mansion to discuss and set prices for, set wages, set prices, set the rules for the labor market. And this is still true. In the 50s and 60s, this was all there was to it. This was the whole labor market, these meetings. And they all did this together, all together. So you had the government, the unions, and big business working together. You couldn't really tell them apart. Then in this state, has been centralized for a very, very long time. From 1523 to be exact. Everything has been run from the castle in Stockholm. We have a social security number, as do most states, but we also have a national ID card, like we were talking about having here. And everything you do is always based on the social security number. You never give companies or the state your name or address. You just give them the number, and they're all hooked up to the system. So you have a few problems here. I'm going to give you an example on banking and insurance. Because when I moved here, the first thing you need to do is tell the tax authority that you've moved, give them your new address, and they send you documents so that you can sign it and do all the paperwork. And then all these companies where I have my bank accounts, where I have my insurances, they get the update from the tax authority. Now the funny thing is that the tax authority, they just happened to write the wrong address to me. So all the documents from the banks and everything went to another address somewhere in Sweden. So I called them and said, I'm not there, could you change the address? And the bank told me, their customer, that, sorry, you're not allowed to change your address. And I said, what? Well, they said, we get an update every 6 months from the tax authority. You have to change it with them. We can't just get an address from you, our customer. We get it from the tax authority. So that tells you a little bit about the centralization and the corporate reliance on government. Now let's have a look at the growth. I mean, where did Sweden get rich. And you've already seen what happened after the deregulation in the late 19th century. And then what happened? Well, you had the world wars. Sweden wasn't part in either of them. Sweden wasn't part in World War I. It wasn't part in World War II. We were neutral in both wars. And what did that mean? Well, it meant that after World War I, when Europe was devastated, Swedish industry was still intact. So Swedish industry could produce everything and export to all these countries in Europe. And they really needed this stuff. So Swedish industry could become very, very rich through not being part of the war. Which tells you a little bit about the so-called broken window fallacy from Bastiat, if you've read it. Some people say that if you destroy something, it's good for the economy because then you have to rebuild it. Well, the problem is if you destroy something and rebuild it, you never know what would happen to that money if you didn't destroy it. It would still have been invested somewhere. You would probably still have produced something. And this is a perfect case of this, because nothing was destroyed in Sweden. So Sweden could still produce everything. What happened to the rest of Europe? They were devastated. They were importing Swedish stuff. They were rebuilding their country partly with what was produced in Sweden. And of course, you can see this if you follow the numbers, the official numbers of growth and employment. You can see that after the wars, it went up. And you could see that prosperity in Sweden is going down like this all the time. And then after the war, going down again, going up, going down again. So you can see that this prosperity is because we did not take part in the wars. Of course, neutrality is within scare quotes, because we weren't really neutral, but we didn't take part in the war. So let's have a look at this after the wars. Well, in the 50s and 60s, we had enormous growth, but I think that is true for the whole world. In the 50s and 60s, after the war, there was a lot of growth everywhere. And this is also where, like I told you before, about the self-abundant spirit, that labor unions, big business, and government, they were in the same boat, and they were chatting with each other and setting wages on a very, very centralized level. Then growth suddenly ended around 1970. What do you do in an economy that is exporting, that is very, very dependent on other countries importing your products? Well, there was no more world wars, so you couldn't rely on that. Instead, you can devaluate your currency. You can forcefully write down the value of your currency, which makes your products a lot cheaper for other countries, which was done in 1976, then in 1977, one more time in 1977, again in 81, and then in 82. And these devaluations of the currency, they were between 3 and 16% every time. Of course, if you write down the value of the currency with 10%, everybody loses 10% of the value of whatever you own. So you get to export more, but everybody gets poorer. And we will see this later, that this is really what happened. Then in the 80s, you had constant deficits. The Swedish government was spending a lot of money, but they were borrowing everything. So in the happy 80s, where you had this growth in all industries, people were making a lot of money, not in Sweden. Some people were making money, but most, they were lost through the devaluations, and the government was spending a lot. Then in 1990, due to the crisis, the whole cabinet of ministers resigned. Because they couldn't take it anymore. There was so much problems with the finances that they couldn't stay in power. And in 92, you had this international crisis with currencies, where a lot of speculation in different currencies made them fall, totally fall. And part of the problem here was that a lot of currencies were tagged to each other. in an attempt to make a pan-European currency, what you have now in the euro, which Sweden is not part of. And in 1992, just to try to defend the currency, the Swedish central bank had the interest rate at 500%. Imagine if you have a mortgage on your house and the central bank is setting the rate at 500%. So every year you have to pay 5 times what you borrow. That's a pretty bad situation. Well, it didn't last. So they let go of the currency, stopped controlling the currency. And what happened then was that you had a market devaluation. Obviously, the Swedish krona was artificially valued too high. So it immediately went down 30%. Then it went up a little bit, so I think it lost around 25% of its value. So 1/4 of the value of all Swedish people and companies were suddenly lost within a couple of years. Interestingly here, like we said with devaluations, that they devaluate the currency in order to export more products. Now this market devaluation of the currency led to Swedish production going from 27% exports to 52% exports in less than 10 years. So now Sweden is very, very dependent on exporting. Now let's take a look at the drop on a more macro level on Sweden as a country. Well, let's just show you that I'm not bullshitting. It's true. Now, the drop. In 1970, like I told you, after this enormous growth, Sweden was pretty wealthy. It was number 3 in the world, which is pretty good. Switzerland was number 1, I think. I'm not sure which country was number 2. But in 2000, Sweden was 19, and this is all GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power. And in 2008, this year, there was an article in the journal discussing the poorest middle class in the Western world. Which should tell you something, that probably Sweden is not 19 anymore. Now this is just a political, economic history in very, very short terms. Let's move on to why this happened and why no one is doing anything about it. The Swedish mentality. Now I'm not sure you recognize these guys, but this is ABBA. That's usually when people say Sweden, they think of ABBA, blonde girls, and I don't know what snow probably. Now we talk about the central state, the centralized state. But it has been a kingdom for 1,000 years, and the king has always had the power. It's never really been the case that you have the nobleman being in power and the king was trying to organize them, which was the case in many other countries. In Sweden, the king was the man. He was ruling the land, literally. Now, since 1523, the nation-state has been controlling people. The nation-state, you have always been able to turn to the state to check out where people are. There have been records of exactly who lives where, who marries whom, since 1523. And just to show you that the state also controlled the economy, then we've had a central bank since 1668, which is the oldest one in the world. And one problem in Sweden is that Swedes believe in efficient government, which means that if you have an election and you have a party winning the election, nothing should stop that party from doing whatever they want because they won the election. That is part of what Swedes think about Swedish politics. So there is really no constitution. There is no Bill of Rights. So any government can basically do whatever they like. We have a number of laws. Well, you do that here too. We have a basic set of rules and laws that are supposed to be kind of a semi-constitution, if you will. We have a lot of laws that are in obvious conflict with the set of laws. No one really cares. So you can actually go to jail for a crime that is not allowed in this semi-constitution. And you will stay in jail. Now the political system, it follows from the efficient government that the central government, the national government, controls the other levels. There are 3 levels, just like here. You have the national, the regional, and the local government. The local government is a great example of the semi-constitution. The local government is supposed to be sovereign. The local government doesn't really do anything else at all. It just is kind of the executive power doing whatever the central government is telling them to do. Now, for the political rule, Sweden is a socialist government. Here we have the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democrat is almost like a liberal here. It's a little bit more socialistic probably because this is in European terms. As you can see, in 1932, the Social Democrats gained power. They held power for 44 years. They lost power for 6 years. They stayed in power for another 9. And then they lost a little bit again. What's funny with this is that the only reason they have ever lost power after 1932 is not because people have found a better alternative. It's because they want someone else to do the same things. So in 1976, when they lost power to non-socialist people, non-socialist parties, who promised to do the same thing as the Social Democrat Party, but a little bit more efficiently. And the same thing in 91. And in 2006, they actually lost power to non-socialist parties promising to increase the welfare state even more than the socialists would. So that's a non-socialism in Sweden. It's kind of interesting. Now the Socialist Party, as you can see in 1940, they had 53% of the votes. This is in a country where you have 7 parties in parliament. 7 parties, and they had 53%. In 61, they had still a majority by themselves. And today they're really weak, historically. If you look at it historically, only 39.6%. Now, but they told you there are 7 parties in parliament. These are the other ones. The blue ones are the non-socialist parties. The Conservatives, the Social Liberals, the Christian Democrats, and the Center Party. As you can see, they're pretty small, except for the Conservatives. And the Conservatives is really the reason the Socialists are not in power right now. Because the Conservatives have just remodeled their whole program. They want to increase the welfare state more than the Socialists. That's why they have 26%. And then, of course, you have the Greens and the Communists. And the Communists have recently lost a lot of their support. They used to be around 10, 12%. Now let's see here again, how do Swedes look at themselves? And this is an interesting quote that I found. It's from a master's thesis written in Minnesota about Swedes. It says, if one asks a Swede what is the most prevalent characteristic of their society, they would probably say, we are envious of our neighbor's good fortune. And this author says, after talking with enough of them, one would come to realize it is truly a widespread mentality in the Swedish society as a whole. In fact, the Swedish Institute of Public Opinion Research found that in a poll conducted of which traits Swedes identify themselves mostly with, envious was at the top of the list with 49% of the respondents. Which tells you a little bit about how Swedes think. If a neighbor gets a new car, or the neighbor earns a lot of money, you don't congratulate that person. You hate him. You immediately become this guy's enemy. And you talk to the other neighbors saying, what's wrong with this guy? How did he trick the system? How could he make us poorer? Which is how Swedes usually reason. And this is not a joke. I'm not making this up. This is actually true. And part of this is Scandinavian culture. We have something called the law of Jante, which is half fun and half serious. This is from a Norwegian author who wrote a book on this law. But this is actually how people think. don't think you are anything. Don't think you are as good as us. Don't think you're smarter than us. Don't fancy yourself better than us. And so on. Swedes really think that they are not worth anything at all. And someone else is always better. It's not that I am good. It's someone else is better. And you can try this yourself if you meet a Swede. Tell them that they're really good at something. And the response will be, no, this guy is better. They will never say thank you. Which is kind of interesting, I think. Now, this was not always the culture in Sweden, because then the country was just not survive. I mean, how could you survive with a lot of people taxing themselves to death and thinking someone else is always better? Why would you do anything? Well, this has been going on for about a little bit more than 100 years. It's changed Swedish mentality pretty radically. Now, I usually divide this into 3 generations since 100 years ago. I usually do this in my own family. My grandmother, when she was still alive, she had the hard-working mentality, the hard-working morality. She was talking about a real Swede takes care of him or herself. We work hard, we never ask for help. We can do it ourselves. This is the mentality of the 1 million people that emigrated and came here to the U.S. And then I call them the children of the welfare state, which is basically my parents. They want something, and they want someone else to give it to them. They don't have to earn it like their parents' generation. They have a right to it, which is a very different way of seeing things. Then you have the grandchildren of the welfare state, which is, well, basically me. And we're even worse. We don't even have to ask. Someone has to give it to us. And this is, I know this looks pretty weird, and the way I'm telling you seems out of this world, from a sci-fi movie or something. But this is actually true. You see people today, my wife had surgery. In the next bed, there was this girl, 20 years old. She was on sick leave, which means that she got 80% of her salary from the government. And she had surgery, so she was sick again. And she asked the doctor if he could somehow document this so she could have sick leave from her sick leave. Which is kind of ridiculous. And if you think about it, why would you want 80% of your 80%? But she wanted more, of course. Now, with all this, I have a right to. You would kind of think that people don't enjoy taxes. They want other people to pay taxes, and they want to keep their own money. Not really. That's not the way people see it in Sweden. This is a very, very common comment in the media. When you pick someone on the street, ask them, what do you think of this system? What do you think about healthcare right now? What do you think about the taxes, whatever? They always say, I would gladly pay a little more in taxes if we could just get more healthcare or education for the money. So high taxation always means more benefits. You always get more benefits than you pay for, which is the way people see it. For some reason, Swedes never pay all of it themselves. Someone else is paying. And a good example of this mentality where you actually embrace taxation rather than try to stay away from it is the 94 general election, where the non-socialist parties lost power. The reason the Social Democrats got back into power was that they promised to raise taxes dramatically. So they won the election. Which is kind of interesting, comparing this to the presidential election here. And how many of the candidates promised to raise taxes dramatically? No one. That would totally kill your political career. But in Sweden, That's the way to go. That's the way to go. If you want to win the election, promise to raise taxes more than the other guy, which is really not that difficult. I mean, just increase whatever, another 10%, and that's it. Now let's take a look at this taxation. You usually see this: we pay only 30% in taxes, which is what people believe, and that might probably be part of the reason why people want higher taxes, because they think they pay 30% and they're getting this healthcare and education and all this stuff. So why not pay 31? 30 is not that bad. Well, I just took an example of myself here, and I was making quite a lot of money actually. So I think the average salary is probably half of this. And as you can see, out of 40,000, I got about 20, 21, something like that. But out of this 40,000, which was my gross salary, my employer paid 53.5, because he always had another third on top of my gross salary, which is just taxes on my salary before I pay taxes. Then afterwards, there's a pension fee. Then there is the local income tax, which is usually 35%. That's the 30% in taxes that a Swede would tell you about. The local income tax of 35%. That's the only 30% that we pay. But then you have a national income tax if you earn more than just a little. It's 20%. And then you have another bracket of 25, so it's a progressive system. Now, as you can see here, I calculated my taxes. This is just the income tax. It's 60% of what I earned, or 60% of what my employer paid. So I got to keep almost 40%. But this is just the income tax. Of course, there is not only income tax. There's corporate tax, which I didn't pay, of course. But then there's the sales tax on everything that's 25%, which is a little bit higher than here, I guess. But you never see the sales tax. Just like with all these other taxes that are just withdrawn from your money before you see the money, so you never really realize that they were there. The sales tax is always included in the price. It's never added like here. So you never really can tell that it's this much taxes. But it's always 25%. I think nowadays they changed it on food to 21%, so that's a big deal. And of course, the tax rate on the whole is greater than 50%. This image here it's really funny. I had to have this in my presentation because last year, Sweden has always been at the top of taxation, tax rates. And last year, Sweden was number 2 in the world. Denmark has higher tax rates. This is the image from all the Swedish newspapers that day. And as you can see, the Swedish flag is the one in blue and yellow. The Danish one is the red and white. And the headlines in the newspapers were, Sweden is only second, Denmark is ahead of us, and stuff like that. Tells a little bit about how Swedes think. I mean, this image wouldn't really, to an American, mean, hey, Danes are paying more taxes than Swedes. This means that Danes are ahead somehow. Well, they are ahead with taxation. That's it. Now let's see what you probably wonder, what do you get for all this money? Let's take a look at the welfare state and the free healthcare, for instance. Most people have heard of Swedish healthcare being pretty good, high-tech. It's about the same standard as here in the U.S., I would say. You have the regional government controls all the hospitals. There's no such thing as a private hospital. Forget it. They're all publicly owned and run. And the funny thing is that this regional government, they take money for health care from the same budget as public culture and public transportation. And public transportation is heavily subsidized. In the region where you pay the most, you pay almost 50% of the cost when you take the bus. So of course, if people start taking the bus, you get less health care. If people visit museums more, you get less health care. Which kind of makes it a little bit weird. So the task or the objective of the politicians on the regional level is to distribute the money between culture, public transportation, and healthcare. And you might think that they would give everything to healthcare because that's more important. Well, public transportation and culture get about as much as healthcare. And the hospital experience is kind of interesting with this free system, because everything costs money. When you go to a Swedish hospital, there are fees for everything. There's a fee for for calling an ambulance. There's a fee for going to the emergency room. There's a fee for every night you spend in the hospital. There's a fee for every meal you eat. There's a fee for every kind of surgery you get. Of course, the fees probably don't cover all of it, but this so-called free healthcare is very interesting. When you have fees for everything, you have to pay. So in Sweden, actually, you do have people not earning a lot of money, not going to the hospital because it costs money. After that, they have paid probably 70% of what they earn in taxes. So free healthcare is not free, to summarize it. There are some benefits, though. If you get into the system, I mean, it's the same with everything. If you subsidize it, you get more of it. If you subsidize sickness, which is the case in Sweden, where you get 80% of your salary if you don't work, or at least 80%. If you're a member of a labor union, you usually get, I think my dad would get 102% of his salary if he's sick. Why do you work? Well, you don't. And if you get into the hospital system, then the treatment you get and the healthcare you get is actually pretty good. The problem is getting into the system, because they really don't want to treat you. Because they have a budget, and they can't really have deficits, which is a good thing, of course. So the problem is, if you really need surgery, you should try to get surgery at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the fiscal year. Because at the end, there's no money left. They used it already. And of course, you have this system where you have to see a doctor first. Well, you have to see a nurse first, then a doctor, then a specialist, and to another specialist, and then you might get surgery. There are examples of people are dying while they're waiting health care, but that's usually not something reported in the media. But the common situation is if you need surgery and it's not urgent, if it's very urgent, then you get surgery. Because they can't just let you die there. There would be bad PR. But if you need surgery and it's not very urgent, you usually see a nurse, then a doctor, then a specialist, and another specialist, and they recommend that you have surgery, and they will usually tell you that within 12 to 18 months you will get a letter with a time period where we will let you know when you get surgery. So it's not getting an appointment for surgery. They tell you that within a year or a year and a half, you will get a letter with a time when you will get notified if you get surgery, which is an interesting way of seeing healthcare. I mean, your health will not get better in 18 months, probably. Now, see, there are differences, though. I mean, there are some things that are working. Apart from the pharmacy being a national monopoly, which should tell you something about the efficiency of that organization, medicines don't really cost that much. And you never pay more than $150 in a year.
Sorry, just a quick clarifying question. Okay, so within 12, so it's not that you get your surgery within 12 to 18 months. It's within 12 to 18 months, and not even that within 12 to 18 months you find out when you'll have surgery. But within 12 to 18 months, you find out, they give you a range during which they'll make a decision about whether you'll have surgery or not?
Yes, the common case is that you will get a time period where they will notify you. But it works different in different regions, but that's usually the case. Now they're trying to establish a healthcare guarantee so that you will get treatment. But usually where they have it, it doesn't work at all. Because you're guaranteed to see someone, but they don't have the money or the time to actually do something. So you will get a letter saying that you will get a letter. That's how that guarantee works. But at least you get the letter, which is something. Well, the pharmacy, you never pay more than $150 a year for medicines. And those are, of course, prescription drugs. Otherwise, you pay just like here, over the counter. Now, to take another example, healthcare and education. In Sweden, you have 9 years of mandatory schooling. And if you don't go to school, the police will actually go to your parents and get you and drive you to the public school, which is kind of an interesting way of seeing education. Then after that, you have 3-year high school, which is voluntary. But I will get to the meaning of education in the Swedish labor market just in a second. I will show you that it's voluntary formally speaking, but if you don't go to high school, you're screwed. And then there's the university education, and I've been through that. Then it works pretty well. It works really well. The standards are, of course, they were better last year, even better the year before that, but it's still good education. And there's no costs whatsoever if you go to school. As a matter of fact, you have a national student support system which gives you a monthly allowance if you go to school. So that when you see the official numbers for unemployment in Sweden, it's probably around 6 or 7%. But you have all these programs where you try to hide it. So if you actually see the people who should be working, but who are not, you're around 22%. Not working. A lot of them are putting special university programs just to have them do something else for 3 years or 4 years, and to get their money from a different budget, which is really what's going on. But this student support system is actually working really well. I got a whole year studying for free in Honolulu, and they paid me for it. Of course, it's a part of it is student loan, but I don't really have to pay it back. And I can just push it into the future, and when I turn 65, they will just take it off the books. So I got a free full year in Hawaii, which is pretty nice. And you could say I earned that since I paid so much in taxes. But the problem with this is, of course, that if you have free university education and you actually get money to educate yourself, now who would not get an education? So you have these weird effects on the labor market that when you try to get a job, they will ask you about your education, of course. Well, if you're trying to get a job as a clerk, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, actually if you don't have a master's degree, you might be in trouble. Without a master's degree, you wouldn't get a job. So usually you see the people the people you pay to in Walmart, those people in Sweden would have at least a bachelor's degree. So we're all very well educated, which is a good thing, I guess. And you can discuss philosophy with anyone working in Walmart. That's not really why you go to Walmart. So you have this, it's all really screwed up in the labor market. If you want a good job, they would probably ask you, why do you only have one master's degree? Which actually happened to me. I was applying for a job as a consultant. I think it was a Boston Consulting Group or something like that. And I had 2 master's degrees, and they told me that my my education was not good enough, which was kind of interesting. And then I had a master's degree in information technology and one in political science. And I was applying for this job as a consultant within information technology, focusing on the public sector in Sweden. So you would think that information technology and politics, knowing that would be a good thing. Well, only master's degrees? Sorry. We have other better candidates. So that's how it works. Now, let's have a look at Sweden if it was the 51st state. And I found this report that I told you about pretty interesting. This was in 2002, so a lot has happened since then. I'm not sure in what way things have changed. But if Sweden was the 51st welfare state, then Sweden would be the poorest state, without a doubt. And Swedes, if the Swedes were an ethnic group in the US, would be poorer than blacks. Which is pretty interesting for one of the richest countries in the world, as people say. Do you have a question?
What's the GDP?
Good question. I'm not sure.
This is per capita, right?
Yes, this is per capita.
Lower than Mississippi.
Mm-hmm. The problem here is too, if I told you the numbers, you would have the problem with currency exchange rates. And the dollar has been going up and down like crazy these last few months. So it would be wrong whatever I told you. But if I told you this was in 2002, the dollar was pretty strong back then, I think, a little bit stronger than now. So things might have changed. Okay, questions? Impressions? Want to move to Sweden?
I think I want to know about Sweden, the Swedish economy, Swedish welfare state.
Overall, how does Sweden compare to assuming Norway?
Norway is a special case because Norway, they have a lot of oil. Last thing I heard was in Norway they have as much oil as Saudi Arabia. So Norway, they have a specific resource that people really want. So they have more money. But in terms of political system and the economy, it's structured almost the same way. And the mindset is almost the same as well. I mean, they never have these huge deficits because they just pump a little bit more oil. And everything, I think all the oil in Norway is pumped by what is called state oil, which you can guess is a state-owned company. So the government is really controlling that resource.
I know this question is going to sound a little vague, but how happy would you say Swedes are?
I can tell you Danes are really happy. They were the happiest people in the world a few months ago. Swedes are usually... That depends if you ask in the summer or the winter. Because in the winter it's really cold and dark, so Swedes would be really, really cranky. And in the summer, since in Sweden it's the law that you have 5 weeks of paid vacation from work. And the law also says that you need 3 weeks together in a period during June, July, or August. So in the summer, they're really happy. And also, when you're on vacation, you usually get something like 105% of your salary. So you get more when you're not working. And of course, the summer is really nice. So, well, overall, I think Swedes are not very happy. But, sure, in July, then they're really happy.
What are labor market regulations like? How easy is it to hire and fire?
It's really difficult. It's not that difficult to hire, but really difficult to fire. Sweden is it's a special case because there really isn't much of laws regulating the market. Instead, you have this, as I talked about before, you have the three big ones, the big business, labor unions, and government, and they're making these arrangements for the whole market. They're deciding everything. So it's not legally regulated. But instead, you have these rules on a very centralized level, so you can't really escape from that. But then you have a few laws. You have the last in, first out rule, which is a really big problem for youth. This is always the case. I worked for a company, for instance, where they said that if we could, we would keep you, but sorry, last in, first out. So they fired me. Of course, it all works the same way as tenure, I would say. I mean, if you stay long enough, you never get fired. So why would you work? And the same professors don't work. But in Sweden, of course, if you've been in a certain position for 20 years, and people have been hired for 20 years, there's no way you're going to lose your job. Which means that in many factories, you don't really have production on Monday mornings. And you don't really see anyone there Friday afternoons either.
I don't have tenure yet, which is why I'm here talking to you guys about Sweden. I'm watching TV.
I have a question maybe a little silly, but kind of this is American, and I think of IKEA, I think of Sweden, I think of IKEA. So my question is, I didn't see the list of sort of the big old companies that developed in the early 1900s. So how would you explain that this uber efficient corporations have come out of the country with sort of welfare state mentality? What are your thoughts?
IKEA is a special case. IKEA is probably, well, it is the #1 case study in all business schools in Sweden because no one really knows where the heck they came from. And how come they're so efficient? And also, it's not a publicly held corporation, so no one really knows about their profits. And the reason I didn't list them is because it's a much younger company. It's still run by the same guy who founded it. How do you explain it? I don't know, really. I guess, well, the idea is, of course, very Swedish. If you have this much taxes on everything, you can't buy something that someone actually assembled and then sold to you, because you have to pay taxes on labor. So other furniture is really expensive. It's a lot cheaper if you take time off your work and do it yourself. So the idea is very, very Swedish in that sense. And of course, as I told you, I mean, if you call your employer and say that, hey, I'm sick today because I have to assemble IKEA furniture, then you get 102% of your salary or something. So I mean, it's a very good deal buying cheaper furniture, getting paid to assemble it. So that could possibly explain part of the success.